Our next speaker is Dr. Rema Raman. Yeah, so she'll be speaking remotely. Her talk is on racial ethnic disparities among adults recruited for a preclinical Alzheimer's disease trial. She's been a leader in the statistical analysis of many of the major clinical trials, and we look forward to her talk.
Thank you. And yeah, can I just confirm that you can see the slide and that you can hear me clearly?
Yes.
Great. And thank you, Anand, and thank you, Igor and Murali, for the invitation to be a part of this workshop. It's really been very, very exciting and illuminating. What I'm going to talk about is really going to focus on clinical trials and some of the experience and some of the work that we have done in this, in looking at racial and ethnic disparities among individuals who participate in preclinical Alzheimer's disease clinical trials. So most of the talk will be focused on the preclinical space and I will try to connect it a little bit with the symptomatic space. And these are my disclosures, and I really just wanted to share the many programs that I have the fortune of being a part of that has driven a lot of the thinking, the learning, and sort of the interest in trying to understand a lot more about these disparities that we are encountering in the Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's disease-related dementia trial space. I'm going to do this in 3 parts, and I'm going to begin by framing the issue on clinical trial recruitment. And Dr. Walsh-Bomer just beautifully did this with many of the same, some of the same work that I was going to present. So I'm going to just go through that very quickly and really just set the frame the issue in terms of why this is a critical aspect of things to consider. We all know the challenges to trial recruitment. It is probably one of the most common reasons is for trials to fail is inadequate recruitment within the right time frame. And when you don't meet the recruitment goals, these goals take a really long time. There are consequences to these to this, including delays in learning, delays in treatments advancing, threats to the internal validity of the study with time becoming a potential confound, raising concerns about generalizability of results, which is really what the focus of this entire workshop is and in some sense, and this talk is. All of which could lead to these disparities that may occur in disease treatment. I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about the differences in observational and studies and clinical trials that impact recruitment strategies. My belief that clinical trials probably are some of the hardest trials to recruit to, and in particular to recruit a diverse sample to. And there are some reasons for this, and I just want to take a few minutes to talk about what they might be. And I'm thinking about this in 6 different aspects. One is really the, excuse me, the question of interest, which is the effect of the treatment. The primary goal of a trial is to evaluate whether the intervention of interest works or not. Everything else that we do is secondary to that, to answering that question. The eligibility criteria, because of safety reasons, tends to be very narrow. The strict protocol has to be followed for the intervention. We've heard this just recently about randomization and the concerns around participants when you talk about randomized trials. Probably something that we really have a lot of attention to. In our trials and across the space in trials, the visits are frequent, much more frequent in nature when compared to observational studies. And we have risks of adverse events and serious adverse events. In almost every interventional study that you have, and in pharmacological studies, these are much higher risk. So transitioning to ADRD trials, we face numerous barriers to successful enrollment, and these include both participant or patient-related barriers, as well as caregiver or study partner-related barriers. And these are just some of the barriers identified by several investigators, including Grill and Karlovich, as well as Grill and Galvin in their work several years ago. And these barriers continue. including comorbidities, including attitudinal barriers, and the availability of a study partner, which is very unique to AD trials. This need for participant dyads, including logistical challenges and financial challenges as we look at preclinical trials that take a very long time to complete. But I want to start transitioning to disparities, and before I transition to that, I want to set this in the context or in a scientific context. And that is to talk about populations and sampling and why a representative sample is really critical for the work that we do. So if you define successful recruitment as efficiently achieving full enrollment, that's only part of the story. The second part of the story is the accrual of a sample that is representative of the greater disease suffering population. So it's important to know who is really eligible to receive the treatment that is being studied. It impacts generalizability, it impacts representativeness. So understanding recruitment bias is really critical to the work that all of us do in our clinical trials. And you saw this data just now, and just I want to reiterate, this is some meta-analysis and systematic reviews that have been done that really give you sort of the best case estimates. The numbers are much worse than this in terms of the racial and ethnic distribution of participants in our AD trials. Suffice to say, we have a long way to go to establish representative samples, especially around race and ethnicity in our trials. This is a slide that sort of reflects a lot of the learnings that we have learned from the Alzheimer's Clinical Trials Consortium's work. And I'll talk a little bit about the consortium and what we're planning to do later in this talk. But I really wanted to spend some time talking about what are the barriers that we are finding towards diverse representation in our trials. This is really work and learnings from the ACTC's Recruitment Engagement and Retention Unit that I co-lead with Joshua Grohl from the University of California, Irvine. And we see 5 different areas that we believe needs to be addressed. One is around infrastructure, sufficient, sustained, centralized engagement and outreach efforts that need to be put in place for trials that currently may or may not exist. Investigator incentives, lack of investigator incentives, and limited to no accountability around diverse sampling, towards a diverse sampling and recruitment strategy. We also have challenges in infrastructure in terms of our study sites and limited geographic diversity of our sites. There are large areas of our country that do not have sites that can conduct AD trials and pharmacological AD trials. Inadequate infrastructure, very little institutional support, insufficient expertise in diverse recruitment, low engagement with the very underrepresented communities that we are trying to enroll. And this is something that we feel very strongly about, and that is the lack of a representative workforce. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what the NIA and the Alzheimer's Association is doing to address this latter aspect. In terms of our communities, this is consistent with what the challenges are across all therapeutic areas. Low awareness, limited knowledge about trials. This is true in AD as well. The mistrust and distrust. But in Alzheimer's disease, we have the added challenge of disease stigma, which is true in many underrepresented groups, including my own, the South Asian community. The study designs, we don't make our life easy with our study designs. We have complex study designs, they're long, they're burdensome, we have stringent inclusion and exclusion criteria, and we have some specific ethical considerations that we need to worry about, and we have a study partner requirement. And when we think about us participant dyads, we have to deal with individual mistrust of the system, cultural stigma within families around AD, sociocultural factors, economic factors, and this fear of randomization and clinical trials in general. I'm going to transition to the second third of my talk, which is really to show you some data around the participation by race and ethnicity in our screening from 2 trials. One is the A4 trial that you just heard about, and the other is an ongoing study, which is the AHEAD study. The AHEAD study has just started, so the data is very early in the process, but we are starting to see some trends around race and ethnicity. Just to give those of you who are unfamiliar with the A4 study an idea of what the screening schedule looks like. A4 is a secondary prevention trial, clinically normal older adults, and as was mentioned, you required elevated amyloid on a screening PET before you could be eligible for the A4 study. So the screening process was over 90 days, over 6 visits. At the first visit was when the clinical and cognitive assessments were done, including the CDR, as well as the logical memory, both inclusion criteria. And I'll show you a little bit about who progressed at each stage. Once you pass visit 1, then you are asked to, you get your amyloid PET, and visit 3, you have your disclosure. And individuals who are positive on their PET scans are then eligible to continue on in the study. And so once the randomization was completed for the A4 study, all of the pre-randomization data is now released. It is in GAIN. And we started looking at the screening data to evaluate whether there were biases in who progressed to randomization and who screen failed out at each stage of the study. And I'm going to focus on 2 time points, visit 1 and visit 3. We were also interested in looking at what were some of the recruitment methods that was most successful and in reaching our preclinical participants, and were there differences across our racial and ethnic groups? Remember, this was a study that started over 7 years ago. This is work that our team led, that I led with our team, that was published a couple of years ago, where we looked at differences in referral sources by race and ethnicity, and we looked at the 4 groups that had a large enough sample. And we did see some differences. We saw that Black, African, Hispanic, and Asian participants, self-reports, were identified by sites and participated in the study through site recruitment efforts and local earned media. This is not new. We've known it. This was just a validation of information that we've already known. It is that local efforts that drive recruitment by underrepresented groups. The non-Hispanic white participants, on the other hand, were recruited through a very distributed approach, both local as well as national earned media and other trusted organizations. Equally important was the finding that we did see a disproportionate screen fail rate by race and ethnicity in the A4 trial screening data. And the left side of this plot looks at the cognitive data. The inclusion and exclusion criteria included CDR as well as logical memory 2 scores. This is the likelihood of moving forward. So an odds ratio less than 1 meant that you were less likely to move forward, or you were more likely to screen fail out at that point. And so Asians, Blacks, and Hispanics have a low likelihood of meeting eligibility after that first screening visit. The right-hand side is dependent on those who moved past the screening visits. These were individuals who made it past this first screening visit and then had their PET scans. And you see the same disparity of lower likelihood of meeting the amyloid criteria and continuing on to be randomized in this trial among the racially and ethnically underrepresented groups in the study. And these findings fit those from other groups and other studies, but also contradict or fly in the face of current disease prevalence estimates. And so what this told us was that we still have a lot of work to do to understand the race, ethnicity, social determinants of health as potential modifiers for these associations with disease outcomes. We still have a little bit more, we have work to do to understand these interactions and these associations a lot more in these studies. The advantage of truly open data sharing, which is what the A4 pre-randomization study did, with the data now available in GAIN with over 1,000 downloads all over the world, was the ability for researchers outside of our team to be able to look at these data. And this is work by Dr. Dieters, who showed a negative association between African ancestry and amyloid among those participants Black participants who were screened in the A4 trial, and really looking at showing some of this differential ApoE effects. I want to transition to another preclinical trial, that is ongoing right now, which is the AHEAD 345 study. And this is a platform study with shared screening for sister trials. It's again enrolls unimpaired participants with targeted dosing of lecanemab based on amyloid burden at baseline. And so you start seeing the impact of these scans on screening criteria. But about a year ago, we introduced plasma measures to help improve the efficiency of screening in the study. And this is very early data that looked at some of the differences in A-beta 42/40 ratio, the eligibility rates using that ratio in continuing head screening. And this, again, is the first step of a head screening. And very early in the study, we only had 195 participants who had plasma levels, but we are seeing these same lower eligibility rates of moving forward, even using the blood plasma data. This data is, there are similar findings from presented by Dr. Schindler from the WashU plasma, CSF, and PET cohort. And so this is not just in preclinical AD. This is work led by Josh Grill and working with our team on early AD trials, a meta-analysis of early AD SUD trials, and we're seeing the same issue around disparities in eligibility in early AD trials as well across race and ethnicity. And so I want to end with the last part of my talk, which is really about the Clinical Trials Consortium and the approaches and the initiatives around trying to invest the time, the energy, the resources towards trying to do a better job of identifying much more representative samples, both at screening and hopefully at randomization, that is led by the Recruitment, Engagement, and Retention Unit of the ACT. And the mission of the ACTC, if you're unfamiliar, is to provide an optimal infrastructure, utilize centralized resources, share expertise, all with the purpose of accelerating the development of effective interventions through collaborations, efficiency, diversity, and transparency. And this is the network of the ACTC. It's a distributed leadership model with units providing the subject matter expertise, also distributed across the country, and having 35 member sites all across the country. So a truly distributed model funded by the National Institute on Aging. For the ACTC, we have determined that we have to, that representative enrollment is a priority and an expectation. And the way we do this is through diverse enrollment and defining diversity as extending to all communities traditionally underrepresented in research. And this is now, capitalizing on the efforts by the NIA, by the association, as well as now the new FDA guidance that was just referred to. We are focusing on 5 underrepresented groups right now. The racial and ethnic underrepresented groups that are critical for our understanding of the disparities of the disease. But in addition to those, gender and sexual minorities, as well as socially underserved groups. And these could be groups from rural communities, those with lower formal educational attainment, as well as lower socioeconomic status. We're using the Hollingshead scale, and I'll show you some of the data we are using to inform this. And you heard from Dr. Kind about the Disadvantaged Neighborhood Index, or the ADI. And the way we are approaching this, we recognize that this is a very hard problem. There are no easy fixes, but we're taking a scientific approach. We're taking a data-driven approach to have data guide our efforts and to share this data with the community so that this is something that can be expanded on from the entire research community. And the first thing we decided to do was look at the clinical trial recruitment funnel and where the gaps in our knowledge are at this time. And if you think about the funnel, this is the inverted funnel. The top of the funnel is the reach, which is the widest part of the funnel, the awareness and outreach. You provide information about trials, and then most sites, all sites, then spend a lot of their effort on pre-screening participants before participants consent and come into the formal screening for a trial and then get randomized. And the latter two are very well defined. We collect the data to allow us to inform this. But it's characterizing these individuals who are reached, pre-screened, and identified for the in-person screening that we believe is essential to understand the sample and selection bias and to develop a data-driven approach to recruitment. And this is what we are doing with the ACTC. Just briefly talking about what we have in place and what we have, the plans we have. And first is really to take a data-driven, evidence-based approach around outreach data through qualitative, mixed methods, as well as quantitative analysis, bring rigor into this evaluation of what works, what does not work, and for whom. We are collecting site-level outreach activity data. We have pre-screening forms on our trial website, and the AHEAD trial is our first trial that we're trying a lot of this out on. We have ways to capture central recruitment activities and outreach, all of which to allow a comprehensive analysis of outreach activities, both within and across sites, both within and across studies managed by the consortium. The second aspect is really getting an understanding of what is happening at the sites with the pre-screening. Sites spend a lot of time and effort pre-screening participants, and we really want to understand what is happening there. Who are we reaching, and more importantly, who are we losing at that stage? And so the work that Dylan Kern presented at CTAD is what we're trying to do through our data approach to recruitment, and called the DART study, or the DART database, which is collecting pre-screening data. We begin with collecting very minimal amount of data, but that includes the race and ethnic categories that I will show you in the next stage, as well as recruitment source and the reasons for pre-screen fails. And this is again to allow us to do a comprehensive analysis of the pre-screening activity. And finally, within the consortium, we have established a minimal data set. And several speakers have talked about a minimal data set to really standardize the way in which data are collected to do effective meta-analysis. And we have a recruitment-focused minimal data set that includes recruitment source and reasons for enrolling, along with rurality, the modifying Hollingshead, demographic characteristics that get into biological sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expanded categories of race and ethnicity, as well as the ADI. Zip codes are currently being conducted, although there is some pushback around calculating zip codes. So we are introducing a self-report of community in terms of whether individuals belong to rural, suburban, or urban communities. And finally, all of this is possible only if we have a generation, the next generation of scientists and a workforce that reflects the diversity we have in the field and the diversity we see in our participants. And so I just want to talk about the Impact AD program funded by the NIA and the association, with faculty from the ACTC, which is a comprehensive training program with over 108 trainees who've gone through the program and are alum. And this particular program is, the applications are open until April 30th, if any of you are interested. But this is really our approach of increasing the pipeline of qualified investigators and teams of diverse professionals, the workforce, as well as investigators with diverse backgrounds to work in the design, implementation, and analysis of AD and IDRB clinical trials in the future. So in summary, I just wanted to share, we are seeing this consistent evidence of racial and ethnic differences by race and ethnic differences of these AD biomarker abnormalities. We believe on the prevalence of these abnormalities. We believe it's critically important to collect complete screening data. We don't spend enough time making sure our screening data is complete. And we have to screen diverse trial participants so that we can better understand these relationships of ApoE as well as social determinants of health, as well as recognize if there are screening and sampling biases. Additionally, we're using algorithms to identify people in screening, and we really need these diverse samples to identify if our selection algorithms are impacted by training sample bias. Believe that open data, image, and sample sharing is absolutely necessary, critical for reproducible research, and with data sets being widely available, and the need for diverse investigator teams trained in AD and ADRD clinical trials to engage our participants. And with that, I just want to thank my collaborators, both at the Institute and outside, and our study personnel. Our sites do all of the heavy lifting in our trials, and really the site personnel are really the unsung heroes in this whole effort. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you all for your time, and take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Rema, for that wonderful sort of tour de force about screening and recruitment. The most common reason for minorities to fail at pre-screening is, say, for cognitively intact people, is that they score worse. And I'm wondering, statistically and design-wise, how do you feel about changing the criteria in terms of the threshold, say for MMSE or MoCA, for African Americans, Hispanics, Asians? You have the example in ADNI with EMCI and LMCI, where you change the threshold based on years of education. Have you thought about that? And is that something that could help address this problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think we have been thinking about this, and we have made some adjustments to our inclusion criteria to account for education levels, for instance, to account for that. But I think this is an important question for the field to ask and answer as well, because I think all of these decisions should be driven, in my opinion, through rigorous data analysis and replication. And I think we can do it. We do it in our own studies, but I think it's equally important for these to be replicated in other studies so that we have similar criteria being employed in all of our trials that we do using informed scientific decision making. So yes, we do have education adjusted inclusion criteria to account for this particular issue, but we still recognize that this is something that needs further work.
My name is Ken Actin. I'm working for Duke University. Thank you for very interesting presentation. I was a little bit confused about some facts you explained to us. So
okay.
You were speaking about African ancestry. So I will be glad to know what kind of criteria did you use to determine African ancestry. After that, you were speaking about self-determined race, and you show us that in your database, you have a column with self-determined race. So obviously this is contradiction. So, you know, not every time self-determined race is matched with the ancestry, the real ancestry. So there is my question. Did you use some specific genetic markers to determine African ancestry? And will you link your database with genetic data? Or this can determine by itself, at least, what kind of ancestry this person have really?
Yeah, so let me try and let me clarify what I was trying to do with the ancestry. That is not the work that we have done. That is the work that was done and led by Dr. Casey Dieters, who spoke yesterday, and it was data that she that the analysis was done with the publicly available data. So yes, we are sharing all of our data, including any genetic data that we might be collecting. And this was work that was done outside of our group here as part of the data that is publicly available to anyone. And you can go to GAIN and collect those data if so interested. The self-reported race is something that we believe is necessary and feasible to collect as part of a clinical trial database. And genetic data takes on a completely different framework. So I'm not claiming that we are collecting genetic data on everybody and these analyses are adjusted for ancestry. I believe that there is a really important question to ask and answer about the impact of ancestry on these disparities. The reason we are collecting these self-reported race and ethnicity is because there is data to suggest that there is a difference even in those self-reported categories, because it may or may not have an association with other social determinants of health measures that occur, at least in North America. So there are two different elements of what we are proposing. The self-reported race and ethnicity, which is expanded to use slightly more comprehensive categories that is used in the census, is what we are including in our database for everybody. And then the genetic data, when they do become available, which they will be, is then can be used to evaluate true ancestry, if that is possible. I hope that clarifies what I was trying to say. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. Rema, this is Murli Doraiswamy. Thank you very much for a lovely talk, and hope you can come here next year in person.
Yes.
I have a
definitely. Sorry, I couldn't make it there. Yeah.
No, we understand. I have a follow-up question to what you were just commenting on. It's great that we're making efforts to enroll more underrepresented people, but are we anywhere close to representing SES in our clinical trials? Is there a time when we're going to recruit and stratify by Hollingshead Index, or require trials to have at least 50% of people come from different socioeconomic neighborhood strata, so on and so forth? Otherwise, race alone misses the point.
Absolutely, couldn't agree with you more, Murali. So for the AHEAD study, we are collecting education and occupation and developing this modified Hollingshead. So we do have measures of socioeconomic status as well. And we have recently introduced ADI as another minimal data set, that element that we are collecting, for this very reason, that I think it is about considering diversity in all its forms, because there is intersectionality that one needs to think about as we deal with these issues. Just also want us to be a little careful in over-interpreting a lot of what we are seeing, because I think we still have a long way to go with our recruitment, with our samples, our trial samples, being truly reflective of individuals who might be eligible for the treatment that is being studied. And so I think these meta-analyses, as data get shared widely, allows us to start looking at these a little bit more, so we have larger sample sizes that would allow us to detect trends or associations that could then allow us to better design future trials, and also better use better recruitment strategies to reach a much wider a group of people, increase that access, so that you can get individuals from across the spectrum of socioeconomic status.
Thank you.